what I'd like to do now is introduce you to our moderator for the evening, Waqar Qureshi. Waqar is a volunteer with the AUSii, and he previously worked with Chevron Energy Technology Company. He's currently engaged with several organizations working on strategy and advocacy related to climate change and the energy transition, following a career in the energy industry in technical, business, and strategy functions. Waqar has done a great job pulling this panel together tonight, and I really appreciate all of the hours and time that he spent as a volunteer. Thank you, Waqar.
Thank you, Amy. It's a real pleasure to welcome. I'd like to add my own welcome to everyone who's attending what should be a very interesting discussion. We have members from the Australian American Chamber of Commerce in Houston. I saw that have joined in, but there's also quite a few guest attendees, both from the United States and Australia, who are interested in this topic. So this subject actually is very near and dear to my heart, as it may well be for many of you. I was in Sydney in the last Australian summer, and that was the one with the unprecedented bushfires. Even in the city, it was dramatic, and the scenes on TV that you would have all seen, I mean, they were extraordinary. And the questions that arose for me, you know, when I experienced that was, well, a couple of the questions. You know, how is the climate changing in Australia, and where is it heading? And what efforts are underway to address climate change? And in fact, there are significant actions that are being taken by the Australian government in partnership with business. So in this event, we're very fortunate to have two speakers who are key players in understanding and addressing the Australian climate change challenge. I'll keep the introductions brief. You would have seen their more detailed bios on the event website. So we have with us tonight Mr. Jamie Isbister. Jamie is Australia's Ambassador for the Environment and First Assistant Secretary of the Division for Economic Growth and Sustainable Development in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Jamie was appointed Australia's Ambassador for the Environment in November 2019. He's responsible for promoting and protecting Australia's national interests in global environmental issues, including leading Australia's negotiations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He's also the head of the Economic Growth and Sustainability Division in the department. And we're also very fortunate to have tonight with us Dr. Michael Grose. Michael is a senior research scientist at CSIRO's Climate Science Center. He works on regional climate change processes, attribution and projections in Australia and the Pacific. He leads the Earth Systems and Climate Change Research Hub project on regional climate change projections research, which is part of the NSW, which is the National Environmental Science Program. And he's also a lead author on the upcoming IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So welcome and to both of you. The way that we're going to conduct this panel discussion is that Michael will begin with his presentation describing key findings from the CSIRO State of the Climate 2020 report. And then Jamie will talk about Australian government actions. So Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Waqar, and it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be with you today. So I'm just going to run through a particular report that comes out every 2 years called the State of the Climate, put together jointly by CSIRO and the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, which are the two biggest federal agencies that do work in this area. So just to, can I change slides? Here we are. So just to start off with some of the key messages up front, and then I'll just go through a series of graphs that kind of illustrate some of these points. So the first point is that the report, released every 2 years, draws on the latest climate monitoring, climate science, and also a look at the climate projection information into the future that describe recent events, but putting that in a long-term context, the long-term trends in Australia's climate. And it draws upon peer-reviewed, best available information with an Australian focus. And the main conclusion, of course, is that Australia is experiencing climate change now, and the impacts are being felt by many communities and industry sectors already, and that is projected to continue. And of course, of huge interest is, well, what about the recent extreme events? And it's very clear that they were a function of both seasonal climate drivers. There was particular events in the Indian Ocean and in the atmosphere to the south of Australia and so on that kind of drove those events, along with the underlying long-term trends, kind of made some of those extreme events more likely than they would have been. So just to go through a few key results from the State of the Climate 2020. So this is Australia's high quality temperature record starting in 1910, the orange line over land and the blue in the surrounding oceans. And given some new analysis and some new work, we're now able to quantify how much Australia has warmed since 1910. And that's at around 1.44 degrees, which is a little bit more than the global average, but similar to the global land average. And the warming is fairly consistent between over the land and the surrounding oceans. And you can see that definite upward trend in both those graphs. This leads, of course, to an increase in the incidence of extreme heat and a reduction in the incidence of extreme cold. And this particular metric of extreme heat is the number of days when the Australian average temperature was in the top 1% of records. And you can see very few days early on in the 20th century, I think steadily increasing number through the last half of the 20th century, and then 2019 in particular saw an extraordinary number of days in that hot category for Australia as a whole. Varied a little bit by region, but this trend is very clear everywhere. Climate change is, of course, not just about temperature and temperature extremes. It's also about changes to our atmospheric circulation, land, ocean, atmosphere, and this can have effects on our water availability and rainfall. And the recent 20-year period has seen very much below average rainfall in the southern wet season of Australia. And you can see that as a colour scale in the top map plot, where much of Southwest Australia and Southeast Australia has been below average or very much below average or lowest on record in that 120-year context. And you can also see that in these kind of bar plots at the bottom, with the Southwest wet season showing a steady decline, and importantly, far fewer very wet years, which are important for kind of recharge and filling dams, etc. Fewer wet years and a lower average over the whole 20th century and into the 21st century. It's a little less clear, a little bit noisier on this in the southeast, but it's very clear that it's been dry since at least the late 90s, and very few of those wet years in the southern wet season in the southeast as well. Looking to the north and the northern wet season, which is kind of a monsoonal region, it's kind of almost the opposite. There's been, the last 20 years has been wet on average. There's of course been wet years and dry years. And this is concentrated in the kind of the summer months, those monsoonal months. So the last 20 years has been wetter. I should say that we expect variability from year to year, decade to decade, but especially the southwest getting drier has been looked at very closely, and there's a signal there of human climate change, not just climate variability. The north is a little bit less clear. Increasing temperatures and changes to water availability and humidity and wind and so on all change the incidence of fire danger, of course. And a big component of fire danger is the fire weather. So there's also fuels, there's also ignitions, there's other factors, management, but fire weather is a really important part. And the devastating fires of 2019-20 were due to seasonal factors coming together to produce those terrible fires. But this comes along on top of a steady long-term trend towards greater fire weather danger as a whole. And this is a trend map in the number of danger fire weather days since 1950, or sorry, between two periods, an earlier period and a later period. And you can see the difference is quite stark there, and almost everywhere in Australia is coloured red. There's been an increase in the number of dangerous fire weather days on average. And therefore, when a bad season comes along, it's kind of operating on a higher baseline, if you know what I mean. We also cover what's happening in the oceans, and this is global average sea level. And we've now hit an unfortunate milestone. As a global average, since 1880, the globe has hit around 25 centimetres of global sea level rise. It's very different in different places, and it varies around the Australian coast due to regional factors like ocean currents and so on. It also has a different effect in different places because different places are more vulnerable to sea level rise than others. But the global average is now hit that 25 centimetre milestone, and there's pretty good agreement between the older kind of tide gauge monitoring and the recent kind of satellite monitoring as well. You can see that overlap in the recent period. And not only has it risen by that 25 centimetres, but the rate has been accelerating over that period. You can see a slight upward inflection in that curve, and it's now rising at about 3 centimetres per decade. We also cover what's happening in the atmosphere. This is the carbon dioxide measured at Cape Grim in northwest Tasmania, which is one of the most important air monitoring stations in the world. There's other ones in Alaska and other places. And this measures the kind of baseline or kind of clean air baseline of the world. And you can see a very clear trend and also an acceleration of that trend in the concentration of carbon dioxide. So we're definitely well over that 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in baseline air kind of milestone. We're at now 410. And if you add together all of the different greenhouse gases that we're interested in, that includes methane, nitrous oxide, etc., we're now over that 500 parts per million in carbon dioxide equivalent. And you can see the rise has been accelerating, and you can see that in the numbers in the little panel within the graph, how much it's risen in each decade since we've got reliable measurements, and that number is bigger in each decade. We also have a look at the future. So looking into the future, we can see that many of the past trends are projected to continue, and that includes global temperature rise to continue, sea level rise to continue, factors such as marine heat waves, which is periods when the sea surface temperature is above normal, and that can have really important impacts to become more frequent and more intense. More warm days and more heat waves and fewer cool days on average. Fewer tropical cyclones, but with a greater proportion of those in the high intensity category. That's kind of cutting edge research and is less certain and less confident finding than some other things, but that's the current assessment of the evidence. Cool season rainfall, that wet season, winter rainfall in southern and especially southwestern Australia to continue to decline, get even drier. And heavy rainfall at the hourly to daily scale to become more intense. And that's a pretty confident finding based on just a warmer atmosphere and how it behaves. And longer fire season with more dangerous fire weather days is a really important and relevant finding. It's getting a lot of attention in Australia now, and I'm sure in parts of the US too, like California, that's a big challenge to manage. So I've just given you a brief kind of overview of a few of the main aspects, but there's a lot of other topics covered in the report. So there's more detail on marine heat waves and how they are a risk for coral bleaching. And the Great Barrier Reef has seen some significant back-to-back bleaching events, which is a big concern. There's also content on ocean heat content, the other carbon dioxide problem, ocean acidification. There's background about Antarctica and Greenland ice sheets, and also the area of sea ice in the Arctic and around Antarctica. There's detailed information about heavy rainfall, stream flow, snowfall, tropical cyclones, and also the compound extremes, which is where extremes kind of compound each other. And this is, of course, where you get the biggest impacts. And the long-term record of greenhouse gases from ice cores, et cetera, and putting that recent increase into that longer-term context. And the kind of spoiler alert here, it's the highest it's been in at least 800,000 years, probably 2 million years. So there's the addresses where you can get the report. But thanks very much for having me. Back to you, Waqar.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. Really nice summary of what's an incredibly comprehensive report. So thank you very much for that. We're going to shift over now to Jamie, and Jamie, it's all yours. Thank you.
Great. Look, thanks a lot, Waqar, and also like you, I think great to get the presentation from Michael in terms of what the science is telling us around climate action, sort of the climate science and how it's impacting on Australia, but also our region more broadly. I thought with time I would just focus a bit on sort of just briefly outlining where Australia's been in relation to climate action and our engagement in recent years, but more importantly, where are we going, and particularly how Australia is moving in relation to investments in a whole range of different areas to accelerate efforts on climate action and to get to net zero as soon as possible. Next slide. So just briefly, I think, as people may know, Australia, the key agreement before Paris was the Kyoto Protocols, which provided targets and commitments for how particularly developed countries would reduce emissions. Australia was a signatory to both protocols, both the first and second. And over those both periods, we met our targets, but also exceeded them over time, with at the end of 2020, which was when the Kyoto Protocol second period finished, we'd almost exceeded by a full year of Australian emissions. But obviously the Paris Agreement now sets new targets and how countries are going to be stepping up efforts, and globally how all countries are contributing to those efforts. Next. So just briefly, we've got a target to get to 26-28% reductions from our 2005 levels. Our emissions peaked around 2007, but since 2005, our emissions currently have declined by almost 17%, 16.7%. And that's particularly as a result of issues around how we manage land, our electricity sector, and how we're accelerating emissions in those, which I'll touch on in a second. Next. So just as mentioned, countries are obviously updating a range of their targets, both net zero commitments, but also the 2030 targets. But currently, Australia's targets is for 2030, 26, 28%. A key thing to be aware of, and sort of, I guess, highlights the challenge Australia faces in accelerating our efforts, is per reduction in emissions per GDP. So that's how much we've got to accelerate emissions to the size of our economy, is 60 to 65%, which is significantly higher than a number of our like-mindeds. And that's particularly because of our ongoing population growth and the economic growth that's occurred over the last couple of decades. Next. So one of the sectors that you'll be aware of that's really sort of accelerated a lot of that efforts in recent times, but is going to be critical to us not only exceeding our 2030 target, but getting to net zero as soon as possible, is transitioning our whole electricity sector. It's been, in the last 20 years or so, the uptake of renewables has been very significant. Just in the last 3 years, more than $30 billion has been invested in Australia on renewable projects, particularly solar and wind. We're a world leader in the renewable energy, and particularly in deploying renewables 10 times faster per capita than the global average. And there's a lot of both investments by government and private sector at different levels, but also by individuals. 1 in 4 Australian households today have rooftop solar systems, and many of them include increasingly incorporating battery storage as part of that system. Next. So just to give you a quick sort of, I guess, a graph around the shift in sort of world uptake in distributed energy resources, and particularly rooftop solar, you'll just see that rapid growth over the last 10 years, particularly of Australia, comparing to a lot of other countries. And as I mentioned, that uptake is continuing to grow. Last year, we had the highest investments in renewables we've had in the COVID year, and the projections have that continuing to grow. Next. One of the key challenges, obviously, is as that uptake of renewables comes in, how we better integrate and interconnect our transmission systems. As we bring new renewable energy zones in, we need to have the transmission and grid integration to be able to be ensure that they can be connected into the system. Many people would know Australia is a very diverse geographic country, and one of the challenges we've had is actually having different energy systems for different states. And over the last 10, 20 years, one of the big focuses is how do we better connect systems across Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and be able to allow that ability for supply and demand to drive down costs, but also the uptake of renewables. Next slide. And so the next stage really is moving beyond the sort of electricity, so the renewable side, which is really now going to scale and doesn't need a great deal more investment by the public sector. It's the commercial sector is now driving that uptake. Is how do we move into the next stage of abatement, and particularly in the areas that are harder to reduce in manufacturing, in things like cement, steel production, and what technology is going to accelerate that. Last year, the government announced a technology statement, a roadmap that would outline the technologies that government would be investing in over the next decade to get to that net zero as soon as possible. And the 5 key ones, and I'll touch on them very briefly, but they're ones which are going to be key for how we partner with other countries, including with the US, in delivering that transition to a low emissions net zero future. One is obviously clean hydrogen, how we get it under $2 Australian per kilogram. If we do that, it basically replaces the commercially the need for oil, gas, and fossil fuels for a lot of the areas as mentioned that are hard to abate, whether that's transport, manufacturing, or production of green steel, etc., which I'll come to. Getting energy storage under $100 per megawatt hour. This is critical as we continue to accelerate our electricity sector, because we need that storage to provide the firming power as we have more and more renewables coming online. Looking at how we get to green steel and green aluminium to $900 per tonne and $2,700 per tonne respectively. Because if we get that to there, that basically, again, this commercially will replace the current high emitting manufacturing of these products. Steel, as we know, produces almost 8% of global emissions. So if we can get that, produce that with zero emissions, it makes a huge contribution, not just to Australia's, but global efforts. Carbon capture and storage is critical, we know, again, for those sectors I mentioned that are hard to abate and that transition aspect of it. And if we can get that under $20 per tonne, it really brings in that ability for the commercial sector to effectively incorporate these. And again, it's not necessarily in the areas that have been looked at before. It's more in that areas around how we look at that transition of cement manufacturing production. And the final one is getting soil carbon under measurement under $3 per hectare per year. Because if we can better assess and understand the carbon being stored in our soils, we can be accelerating and better understanding the investments we need to make in sustainable agriculture practices and supporting the agricultural sector in Australia, but our region, to get reduced emissions. Next. So as mentioned, just to quickly flag the approach the government's taken to date, and with this is the approach we use for the renewables, but which we are now going to be using for these emerging technologies, is how we use our academic sector and CSIRO, as you've heard from Michael, who have world-leading researchers looking at these technologies, working out which of them can be potentially commercialised or not. Then we have the government agency ARENA, which is Australian Renewable Energy Agency, that basically then funds into these projects and looks at piloting them, identifying which of them can potentially be taken to scale. And that then feeds into the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is the largest publicly owned green bank in the world, owned by the government, which is then looks at how it uses public funding to leverage private investments in these projects going to scale. And as I mentioned, that's what's really got our renewables to the point they have, and now the commercial sector taking that forward. It's now how we use that approach to deliver on these new technologies. Next slide. The Prime Minister recently appointed our former Chief Scientist, Alan Finkel, as a special advisor on low emissions technology, and he's accelerating these efforts with a lot of partnerships with the US, with the agreement with the new Biden administration, a clean energy dialogue, which is going to look at how we can partner on a number of these technologies that I've mentioned, but also with other countries, Japan, Korea, UK, Germany, etc. Next. Connected to this is obviously what our own industry is doing, and particularly the rapid work that's being done by our manufacturing sectors, our critical minerals resources. We export 54% of all of lithium, and we're a critical supplier of resources for batteries. The work that's being done to look at new flow batteries and approaches that can be critical to this getting storage under 100 megawatts per hour, and how we work to deliver supply chains with industry to drive these costs down. And I encourage you to have a look at the recent Business Envoy that has a range of case studies and examples of what Australia and other businesses are doing on this front. Next slide. So just quickly on adaptation resilience, I think as Waqar said, last year we faced one of the most devastating crises with the bushfires, and that really brought to the front for Australians how the climate is impacting and how we need to adapt to that changing environment. Next slide. One of the things the government really focused on is how do we better leverage. They announced a Royal Commission to look at how do we ensure that Australians are better prepared and able to adapt to future crises. They announced the establishment of a new recovery and resilience agency to guide that whole government approach on things. They announced the establishment of a network of scientists to provide medium and longer term forecasts, including the CSIRO and BOM, to be able to provide information to businesses, governments, and individuals on the upcoming weather environments to ensure that communities can be able to address the crises that are going to potentially hit us in the coming decade. But there's also been significant investments about how we support the recovery of our biodiversity, recovery and support for the environment that was clearly devastated by the recent fires. Next slide. Just to finish, obviously in my role as sort of heading Australia's international climate negotiations, obviously the delay of the COP has been challenging in terms of trying to keep momentum on key things. But Australia and many other countries have really wanted to look at how do we find forums to ensure that when we get to Glasgow in 2021, we can get decisions and outcomes on key areas that are going to be critical to take us to delivering on the Paris agreements and accelerating practical actions. The three key areas, one is obviously establishment of international rules under the Paris Agreement. How do we get Article 6 agreed that can ensure that we can have a mechanism that can provide confidence around driving high integrity offsets that both private sector and potentially governments can purchase as they meet their voluntary and mandatory requirements under Paris. And that's a really key thing, because increasingly as countries commit to net zero, those markets are going to be critical to the outcome. But if we don't have confidence in them, if there's not rigor around the ability to be sure that what's being generated is generating real mitigation, then the risk is you end up losing confidence across parties. Transparency, ensuring that we can ensure that countries reporting of what they're doing and the level of reporting on their inventories of emissions is critical. It's important to have targets, but if we can't then also have the clear evidence and confidence in reporting, then that again risks undermining the collective efforts and ambition of countries. And obviously the big challenge around how we increase climate financing and funding for adaptation in response to the increasing challenges that particularly small island states in our region are going to be impacted from the crisis. Next slide. So I'll leave you with that. I look forward to keeping in touch. And again, I just want to thank the Chamber and Waqar and others for inviting Michael and myself to be able to come along and both present on the work being done on the science and the forecasting, but also some of the action. Thanks.
Jamie, thank you very much. Really impressed by how you were able to compress so much information into such a small number of slides in a short period of time. So thank you very much for that. So I would encourage the audience, please, if you have any questions, just enter them in the chat. I actually would like to take the prerogative here of the moderator to ask some questions that I had, and I'll begin with Michael. And I was just curious, Michael, whether you see what might be considered any areas of good, what you might call good news as far as a change. I'm sure you get this kind of question as far as a changing climate is concerned in Australia, because what you hear about mostly is, hotter and drier, and that's not what we want. But is there any good news in there?
Yeah, and it's important to focus on opportunities as well as the downside. Mostly it is a bad news story, so hotter, drier, worse bushfire conditions, more extreme events, more risk of coral bleaching, etc. is all bad and shouldn't be kind of shied away from. I mean, there is some limited opportunities, like new opportunities for agriculture in areas where it couldn't be before. So there's that kind of opportunity. But I'd also say that the most exciting opportunities are in addressing and reducing emissions and the changes in technology, changes in energy, business opportunities to kind of move that energy transition forward and so on. Those are exciting as well. But yeah, limited good news in the kind of climate change effect itself.
I thought you might sort of respond along those lines, but that's very understandable. Another thought it may be interesting to see draw some connections with the United States, and along those lines with Jamie. You mentioned the U.S. summit that's coming up on Earth Day, which President Biden, I believe, is going to take a role in. Any thoughts around how things may change with the new administration here in the U.S. and whether Australia's I guess approach may change in some way because of that?
Yeah, thanks, Waqar. I mean, as we all know, 2020 was a year, obviously, that COVID impacted on all of us in so many different ways, and sort of begged the questions about how do we both deal with the increasing health challenges and impact and economic challenges that come with COVID, but also it started that plant the seed about what does it mean in terms of the recovery on the other side. And 2021 clearly, just with the ambition of COP26 in Glasgow and the range of events coming into that, and obviously with the Biden administration rejoining Paris and that their active engagement into the multilateral system is undoubtedly really going to sort of step up and drive greater ambition. I think for Australia, a couple of things to state. Our Prime Minister has come out and said that our focus is getting to net zero as soon as possible, and preferably by 2050. He's also outlined that we will be releasing our long-term strategy about how we will get to net zero, and that roadmap will really spell out the areas and the confidence about how we do that. And that'll be an important thing for people to keep an eye on in terms of what the investments, the approaches, and the implications of that are. But it's also the issue I mentioned in terms of what's really being stepped up and additional investments government's making on the whole technology side of things. And that isn't critical only in terms of what it means for Australia's meeting our targets and exceeding our targets going forward, but it's really critical in terms of how we're going to work with countries like Japan and Korea and Singapore and other countries in our region who have got targets that are going to be a real challenge to meet in terms of just the implications of transitioning their economies, their energy systems, and how we work with them on these technologies, both in relation to getting those costs down and the commercialisation of those issues as mentioned, but also how potentially Australia will be an exporter, a key exporter of both clean products and clean energy that will be a driver of that move to global net zero. So they're probably the two things I'd leave. With the summit, but issues going forward is going to be how we really accelerate that practical action and the technology approach, and what that might mean for industry and others to be partnering with us on that, and the release of a long-term strategy and how that's going to outline Australia's approach to get to net zero.
Thank you, Jamie. Appreciate the very thoughtful answer there. A lot of questions have come in from the audience, and we'll try to we've got about 5 minutes left in this discussion, so we'll try to get through these as quickly as we can, and hopefully we can answer most of them. Bushfires, you controlled burning to minimize catastrophic fires, the ancient Aboriginal practice. Is that something that we could do more of? Maybe that's something Michael could talk about.
Yes, certainly. That was mentioned and brought up in the Bushfire Natural Hazards Royal Commission report, and it's something that is more and more, I think, in people's awareness, is that there is real value in traditional knowledge and traditional methods of fire management. I mean, it obviously needs to be adapted to the modern world, but yeah, it's being more and more recognised that of the wisdom in some of those traditional practices, for sure. And just another thing on managing fire as well that links the US and Australia is some big firefighting equipment gets shared between different the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, and that's more and more of a challenge as the fire seasons can start to overlap. So there was fires in California in winter, and there was earlier fire season starting in Australia, and so that strategic planning of sharing that big resources like fire bombers, etc., is a thing that the US and Australia will need to manage into the future as well.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, so there's a question on, I guess, energy sources in Australia. A few questions. I'll try to combine them. This may be more in your area, Jamie. Does nuclear have a potential role in Australia's future? And I'll tie that in with, there's some questions around coal as well. You know, will the transition from coal cause economic pain?
Yeah, thanks, Waqar. Just very quickly on the Indigenous point, it's a really good one. It's actually one that Australian government has been engaged with, particularly internationally as well, how we're working, sharing some of the experience that Indigenous communities have had in managing savanna fire burning and coal burns to sort of better manage land, and through that protect the soils and over time reduce carbon emissions, and how that can be shared with other countries, including in Botswana, but other areas that do suffer from wildfires and an increasing challenge that will come from climate change on that. Just to the point you've asked, I think two things. Look, currently nuclear isn't looked to as one of our energy sources. I think you know, what's clearly coming forward, and one of the big benefits Australia has is with our solar and wind, just commercially the costs now that's coming with that is really sort of driving down not just the emissions, but also the costs of power. And the balance on that is how we use pumped hydro and battery storage as a way to provide the firming capability as that uptake of renewables comes through. On the point of coal, there's two aspects to that. Obviously, one of them is, yeah, I think there's no doubt. I mean, Australia has been a long-term exporter of fossil fuels and energy, and that's been key to the industrialisation of Australia and our region more broadly. And with any transition, that's going to need to look at how do we drive that transition in a way that provides jobs, opportunities, and support for communities, particularly in regional areas. But the exciting side of that, I think, is increasingly seeing with these renewable energy zones and hubs that are being established, and the move towards hydrogen as well in areas, is that some of the similar sort of expertise and knowledge in these areas are going to be critical in a low emissions future as well. But like all these things, yes, it's a challenge, and yes, people can well track and be aware of the political debates within Australia on this. And that needs to be understood and appreciated, what's involved with any transition. With exports, just to finish, to say that, look, I think on that, you know, the key thing there is that you know, how countries themselves transition, particularly our large markets in Japan and Korea, to net zero is going to be the determining factor about how you know, how quickly or not exports of coal from Australia occur. But again, why these technologies are so key, because if we can transition that to green ammonia, green hydrogen, green steel products, then that sort of allows that sort of transition and that ability for countries like Japan and Korea to move from less fossil fuel dependent sources to more clean energy futures.
Thank you very much, Jamie. So we're close to the end of our time. There's a lot of questions. I think we'll take one more, and the rest of the questions we're going to forward to the panelists who may be able to answer them. There's a number here that really good questions we won't be able to get to. Thought maybe to sort of wrap it up, any thoughts? I mean, this is to both of you. Any thoughts around, you know, supposing Australia does achieve getting to net zero by 2050, a very challenging goal. Where does that leave us in terms of the climate at that point in time, even if we do get to net zero?
Yeah, so there's a lot of focus and attention on this these days, as it is now a plausible scenario into the future. So there's a lot of work being done around the world about what are the impacts if we take the actions to get to net zero, and what's the kind of global warming response? Can we limit warming to that goal of well below 2 degrees laid out in the Paris Agreement, or even the aspirational target of 1.5 degrees? I mean, it's true that some further change is inevitable, and we should adapt to the inevitable changes that are coming. But beyond the next decade or two, there's a very different set of outcomes if we follow a very low pathway compared to a higher one. And it's just, by the end of the century is where the real payoff comes, and it's our children's generation that'll really feel the difference. So expect further climate change and further increase in some climate hazards, but limiting that is going to be crucial for the beyond the next couple of decades.
Thanks, Michael. Jamie, would you like to add anything to that, or any closing comments that you may have?
No, I mean, I think it's the only comment I'd sort of make. I mean, Michael sort of talked through what the sort of the science and the Paris Agreement's got. I think the key thing on that is going to be not just what, if we're going to get there, is not just how individual countries each are delivering ambition and actions, but also how we develop coalitions and international partnerships that are going to be able to bring forward that emissions reductions, as Michael said, it's so critical. Because beyond the sort of global framework under Paris, the key thing is how we do that and we deliver that ambitious action going forward. And we bring both governments, industry, investors in a way that can deliver that transition and outcomes as fast as possible.
Thank you. Michael and Jamie, that was wonderful. Really want to thank both of you for great presentations and very insightful discussion. Amy, just for the audience, Amy's added some information in here. We're going to have this session on a podcast, and Amy's put a link in to the chat where you can find that. And once again, I really appreciate both of you coming on and giving us a good overview of what is the state of the climate, and what is the government in partnership with industry doing. It was really great, and thank you to you, and also to all of our audience for joining us.